Hello and welcome to Lyra, Nara. In most parts of the world, school has already started or it's about to start, and depending on where you live, there are many different regulations and recommendations. In some places only online learning or distance learning is allowed. In other places the children have to wear masks and social distance. So I thought it would be really interesting to look at what world-renowned experts have to say about all of these measures, whether they are more harmful than helpful, how these whole measures impact our children's well-being, and what kind of recommendations they make. Before we do that, short reminder, if you enjoy this type of content, please like, share and subscribe, and also do not forget to hit the notification button so you don't miss out on the weekly content that appears here. I would very much appreciate if you would consider becoming a patron and supporting us directly. You can also do so by making a small PayPal donation. Links to our Patreon account and the PayPal link are provided, of course, in the description box below. Thank you so much for that. And without further ado, let's learn about what experts have to say about all of these measures regarding our children's health. And we're gonna start with some really good news, because according to the newest data, children and young people are far less likely than adults to get severe cases of COVID infection, and on top of that, death among children is exceptionally rare. It's close to zero actually. According to Malcolm Semple, a professor of outbreak medicine and child health at Britain's University of Liverpool, and a recent study he and his colleagues published, quote, "We can be quite sure that COVID in itself is not causing harm to children on a significant scale." Global data on the spread of the pandemic shows that children and young people make up only 1 to 2% of cases of COVID worldwide. The vast majority of reported infections in children is either mild or asymptomatic cases, with very few recorded deaths, and even those are questionable, as we can see also from this recent study in the British Medical Journal, where the researchers looked at data from 651 babies and children under 19 who were hospitalized with COVID between January the 17th and July the 3rd. And in this study, the 6 children who did die all had quote-unquote profound comorbidities, according to the researchers. The newest data from multiple countries also shows that children seem to be much less likely to get infected and also much less likely to transmit the virus. And schools do not appear to have played a significant role in propagating SARS transmission. Even when cases have been identified in schools, contact tracing and testing have not identified a large number of secondary cases in most circumstances. Furthermore, several countries have reopened schools without demonstrating a significant increase in cases when community rates have been low. Next, let's look at a very interesting study that was recently updated and published by one of the biggest pediatric hospitals, not only in Canada, but the world, called the Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, also known as Sick Kids. And they released a detailed report that we're gonna have a look at on the harms of school closure on children's physical and mental health, amongst other things. The first version of the document was created mid-June by a core group of healthcare workers at the Sick Kids Hospital and Unity Health Toronto, including those with expertise in pediatrics, infectious diseases, infection prevention and control, school health, psychiatry, and mental health. And then on July the 29th, they updated the report with refinements and even more contributions and endorsements from other Ontario pediatric hospitals, as well as epidemiologists, public health physicians, and a volunteer advisory group of teachers and parents. The report was also reviewed by physicians from adult infectious diseases. So it's really an interdisciplinary report that points out a lot of very, very interesting facts. So let's have a look at them. And one of the interesting conclusions they came to is that the community-based public health measures such as provincial lockdowns, school closures, stay-at-home orders, self-isolation, etc., which were implemented to mitigate COVID and quote-unquote to flatten the curve, have, according to those experts, significant adverse health and welfare consequences for children and youth. Some of these consequences include delayed diagnosis and care for non-COVID related medical conditions and adverse impact on their social development and mental health. Increased rates of depression and anxiety have already been observed according to the report, and increased rates of substance use and addiction as well as suicidal behavior are also believed to have occurred. A recent survey by the Children's Mental Health Ontario found out that 1 in 3 Ontario parents reported their child's mental health has deteriorated from being home from school, and more than half of the parents noticed behavioral changes in their child. These range from drastic changes in mood, behavior, and personality to difficulty sleeping and much more. And the report also points out that those with pre-existing mental health issues have been hit particularly hard. Several organizations, including the American Psychological Association and even the World Health Organization, have also highlighted concerns about the potential impact of lockdown on family discord and family violence, including intimate partner violence and child-youth maltreatment. And who suffers the most, apart from, of course, the children with behavioral and mental handicaps, as well as physical handicaps? The weakest of society, of course. The report points out that emerging evidence indicates that the social and economic burden of COVID disproportionately impacts racialized communities and those with less wealth, so the poor. And they go on to explain why this might be the case. Likely factors would be more crowded living spaces, reduced access to healthcare, PPE or testing, and for some, frontline work with increased exposure risk. Distance learning, they can also conclude further disadvantages that children and youth living in high-burden COVID areas where socioeconomic and language barriers limit access to quality online learning. And the effect on these children and youth education has already been substantial according to the report, and further delays of return to school will almost certainly compound educational disparities that already exist between the disadvantaged groups of society and the well-off ones. This group of experts from the Sick Kids Hospital also made some very interesting remarks about physical distancing and masks. Regarding physical distancing, they state that it is not practical to enforce strict physical distancing in elementary school children specifically, especially during periods of play. Interaction, they go on to say, such as playing and socializing is central to child development and should not be discouraged. During outdoor activities such as recess, physical distancing should not be strictly enforced, especially in elementary school children. When it comes to masks, the report states that there is a lack of evidence that wearing non-medical masks prevents SARS transmission in children and youth. And as we know from all the other documents that we looked at in previous presentations, such as the unmasked video, there is actually zero conclusive evidence that they help at all. The authors also highlight that in order to be effective, non-medical masks would need to be worn correctly, which for many otherwise healthy children and youth will be difficult to do for a full school day. And we know from studies on adults that it is already quite tough for them and to wear a mask for the whole day. And of course, especially for small children, this is even tougher. Even more significant barriers exist for children and youth with underlying medical, developmental, and mental health conditions. On top of that, the report points out that if worn incorrectly, for example, if touched frequently, if it's not covering the mouth and nose properly, if it's removed and placed back without hand hygiene, this mask could lead to an increased risk of infection. It is therefore important, according to the report, to try to find periods in the day where medical masks can be removed. I would go even further than that because several European countries have had children successfully return to school without masks, and we have not seen an increase in cases. Children and youth social development, they rightfully point out, also hinges upon their interactions, facial expressions, and body language. And though important for all age groups, this is particularly so for younger children. And therefore, the addition of masks may increase anxiety, interfere with the therapeutic learning environment, and increase inattention or distraction in children and youth, particularly for those who may already struggle with attention, such as those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, or other developmental disorders. Children and youth with expressive communication difficulties, including those with articulation problems and neurologic issues, and those who are learning the primary language of instruction as a second language, and many others may be also disproportionately adversely affected by having to wear non-medical masks at school, the report points out. The report then goes on to make some recommendations. And they state that many pediatric associations around the world, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Canadian Pediatric Society, and the European Academy of Pediatrics, have all issued statements emphasizing the importance of children and youth returning to school. The authors also come to the following conclusion, quote, based on the evidence available at the present time and the current epidemiology, it is our view that the adverse impacts of school closure on children and youth significantly outweigh the current benefit of keeping schools closed in order to reduce the risk for children, youth, school staff, and the community at large, end quote. The authors also come to another recommendation, namely that they recommend, and their perspective is from a health point of view, that children and youth should return to a daily school model with risk mitigation strategies in place. So they are not in favor of online learning because it cannot replace the physical interactions not only between the children and the teachers, but also between the children themselves. And they have some good advice, in my opinion, when it comes to risk mitigation strategies, such as increased ventilation in classrooms, more outdoor classes when the weather permits, increased cleaning efforts, etc. I also want to point out that as data from European countries such as Denmark, Holland, Sweden and others has shown, masks and social distancing are not only unnecessary, as the infection rate has not gone up when children went back to school without these measures, but even worse, as the Sick Kids report also stresses, it is harmful as it inflicts long-term psychological damage and hinders the development of the children and youth, especially the youngest ones, and also traumatizes them potentially for life. So I think it is time for us to ask ourselves the question whether we want to traumatize a whole generation, or whether it's time to fight for our children's health, not only physical but also mental health. And there are some rays of hope. I want to point out 3 of them here. Some brave people all around the world have started to fight back. In Germany, for example, an association of lawyers is suing local governments and intends to move through the system up to the federal level because of the unjustifiable measures. In Canada, the famous constitutional lawyer Rocco Galati is also suing the local and federal government for the harm that has been caused by the government measures not only to children but to society as a whole. The plaintiffs Mr. Galati is representing are suing the governments of Canada, of Ontario, the city of Toronto, senior politicians including Mr. Trudeau, a number of local Ontario health authorities, health officials, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation over the response to the pandemic. The suit states that the closure of businesses to prevent the spread of the virus was, quote, extreme, unwarranted, and unjustified. Also, that self-isolation measures imposed on individuals were not scientific, nor medically based, nor proven, and that the mandatory wearing of face coverings in some public spaces imposes physical and psychological harm. And when you read through all this complete suit, which is about 190 pages, I'm going to link it, if I don't forget, in the description box below for you. You have to always keep in mind that a lawyer has to base such a suit on facts only. He cannot go to court and expect any type of success with any type of theory. So he has to prepare only facts and present only facts, and that is why I find it very intriguing that he makes some quite stark statements in this suit. For example, the pandemic is false and the measures phony, designed and implemented for improper and ulterior purposes at the behest of the WHO, controlled and directed by billionaire corporate oligarchs. The statement of claim goes on to say that, quote, the plaintiff state, and the fact is that the evidence is that far many more people have died as a result of the pandemic measures themselves than purportedly from the COVID-19 deaths, even if one takes the deaths caused by COVID as a given. Another personality that I want to point out, because I think he and his organization is doing great work, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He is, among other things, the chairman and founder of the Children's Health Defense, which is a non-profit advocacy group which has been campaigning for years in the US against various public health programs such as forceful vaccination and fluoridation of drinking water. And the good news is that he has recently expanded the group's activities to Europe in order to globally fight the situation and defend our children's rights. With all that being said, I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. I invite you to share your own personal experiences with your children and what is going on in your particular school district in the comment section below, and what your thoughts are, of course, on this whole situation and on what the experts' opinions are that I've presented to you here. Also, do not forget to like, share and subscribe and hit the notification button, and consider also becoming a Patreon or making a small donation via the PayPal link that is provided in the description box below. Every little bit helps and your support keeps us going. Thank you so much for that, and until next time, stay healthy.